Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Business Ethics. Today, we're going to continue thinking about what individuals and perhaps even some larger organizations like businesses are obligated to do in terms of providing aid for people, in particular, people who are far from us, people who are not members of our immediate community. They're not, say, friends or family. Perhaps even people that that live in countries that we are not connected to in any way. And so these strangers are people, some of them in need of things like access to clean water and medicine, food, shelter, and like we were talking about last week with Unger. There are some who believe that people who are in positions where it comes at very little cost for them to provide the kind of aid that would help solve problems connected to hunger and lack of access, say, to clean water, those individuals and or businesses are morally obligated to do absolutely everything they can to help mitigate suffering, to help stop people from dying, regardless of whether or not those people are ones that are closest to us or are known to us in any kind of way. So, an idea that that underlies this way of thinking about other people, this kind of obligation that we have, is a way of thinking that that is expressed in a view that is referred to as cosmopolitanism. So the word cosmopolitanism is of Greek origin, meaning what it means is, the definition of the word from which this term derives is citizen of the world. So I'm sure that a lot of you are familiar with images of, people holding hands around an image of the world and things like this, and thinking like we're all in this together. We're all connected just by virtue of us being on this earth, and we're and that connection. What comes with that connection are obligations to help people who are far away, even if they are strangers to us. So this word cosmopolitanism covers a pretty wide variety of views in moral, social, and political philosophy. There are a lot of different implications to what being a citizen of the world has to some big questions in philosophy. And the one thing that they all have in common, and the main thing that we're going to be focusing on, is the idea that all human beings, regardless of political affiliation or where they come from, anything like this, are or can and should be citizens in a single community. And it's all about caretaking that community. We're all in it together just by virtue of being on this earth. Now, although this isn't something that Unger explicitly talks about, this is very much an important way of thinking that is going on in the back of his mind. Just by virtue of being a human being and understanding, by virtue of us being human beings, sharing this earth together, the people in better placed positions, right, are morally obligated to help those who are worse off. And it's this kind of thinking that underlies his argument that, when someone with any disposable income at all, any income that doesn't go immediately for food and shelter and these sorts of things, is morally obligated to donate that money all the money that they can, so all of their disposable income, to charities or organizations like UNICEF that are tackling these big problems like lack of access to food and shelter and water and things like this. Essentially, the idea is, you know, for the price of a movie ticket or a new pair of shoes or something like this, if you can save a life, then you should. So you all watched a video about this. We're gonna watch another one just to run through these problems again, so I can be here to sort of talk through some things. Bearing in mind that this shallow pond example that we're about to go through functions as the most significant or the biggest, the most powerful piece of evidence that that Unger has when he makes this pretty big claim about, you know, every little bit we have, right? Every little bit we might set aside for, you know, a streaming service or, yeah, a new pair of shoes or some music online or whatever, that money, that, you know, those sorts of things aren't things that we necessarily need in order to survive. And since that money could potentially save the lives of other people, we're morally obligated to give that money away to save those lives. So with that in mind and thinking about where the argument's going, let's watch the video.
If you were walking past a shallow pond and heard a toddler struggling in the water, would you ignore the child's cries? Oh, of course not. You'd jump in and save her, even if you'd ruin your shoes in the process. You'd do it even if your shoes cost £100. That's a small price to pay. Yet, if you gave £100 to the right charity, you could save a child's life that way too. There are children abroad dying every day from curable diseases, from starvation, from contaminated drinking water. Globally, nearly 10 million children under 5 die each year from poverty-related causes. If you would ruin your £100 shoes to save one life, you should be prepared to donate at least as much to saving another. Or is there perhaps an important difference between a child drowning in front of you and one dying in a far-off land? The philosopher Peter Singer thinks not. He acknowledges that we have biases that lead us to favor those near us over those farther away, but he argues these are irrational. He believes we in the richer country should be more generous to those in tougher circumstances. A child dying 5,000 miles away is as real and as in need of help as the child drowning in the pond just around the corner.
All right. So we mentioned this new person, Peter Singer. And something to just bear in mind in talking about these things. So I'm treating Unger's argument and Peter Singer's argument the same because they are very much on the same team. If anything, Unger sort of bolsters a lot of what Peter Singer has to say. So when you hear the name Singer, Peter Singer, just know that he and Unger are very much buddies, very much on the same team when it comes to thinking about what we owe people in terms of aid, and especially in the significance of this shallow pond case. So the main thinking, like you just watched and like you've seen in other videos behind the shallow pond case, is that if we can intuitively answer this question about what we're supposed to do when we see a child drowning in a pond, and say we're morally obligated to save the child, I think that a lot of I think very few people would answer anything to the contrary, especially if you're only given two options, yes or no, right? There's very few people that are just going to give the flat out no. There might be some people, maybe some of you even, who are thinking, well, you know, there might be certain things going on where we're actually not the ones morally obligated to save the child. But if, you know, we were really firm about this, sort of like I was saying you needed to be when it comes to the trolley case, and say, nope, there's no exceptions. It's just, you're there, you can jump in, you can save this drowning child. Do you do it? Yes or no? And since so many people answer yes, and I think that even the people that answer no would assume that most people are going to answer yes, that people like Peter Unger and Peter Singer argue is evidence of these greater obligations we have, obligations that are tied up in this concept, in this idea of us being citizens of the world. So the principle that they say we can derive from the drowning child case is one that says, you know, if you can prevent something bad from happening at the cost of something less bad from happening, then you should do it. So the thinking there being, you know, no matter how expensive your clothes are, how expensive your shoes are, whether you're going to be late to work or whatever, you see the drowning child in front of you, and you're sort of given some deep insight into some very basic, fundamental moral principles that we operate on. You know that we're obligated to save this child. And then what they say is there's no rational reason. There's no reason. There's no way that you can rationalize or give a reason why that child who's directly in front of you is any different than another child who is in need of your assistance and to whom you can offer significant assistance, life-saving assistance, at the cost of maybe a pair of new shoes. So once we expand this circle of this drowning child, we see that, you know, the obligations reach around the world. The obligations are, according to them, the obligations are global in the sense that, you know, regardless of whether the kid's right in front of you or the kid is thousands and thousands of miles away, as long as it's not going to cost you significantly to save the child's life, then you're obligated to do so. And again, so from this shallow pond example, that is where that is where this principle is derived, which Kwame Appiah referred to as the Singer principle. Okay, so we have this idea of this basic principle. If you can, you know, we have this idea that that from the shallow pond case, we can derive this basic principle that, you know, basic moral principle that extends to all people across the world, right? If you can prevent something bad from happening at the cost of something less bad from happening, then you should do it. And we can see from this principle comes some pretty severe and intense moral obligations. And as several of you discussed in your discussion board threads in the forums, there is something about this that just doesn't feel right. There's something that doesn't seem right, that just based off of what our answer is to the shallow pond case, that we are saddled with this really incredible, like heavy obligation that comes with the Singer principle. So, like I mentioned at the end of the last at the end of the last lecture, if this is something that doesn't, that kind of moral obligation isn't something that's right with you, Appia might be able to give you a story or understand this in a way that that can help you make a little bit more sense of what's going on here. Essentially, he can lighten the obligatory load that Shallow Pond and the Singer principle saddled us with. So in his paper, as you all read, he explains why the Shallow Pond isn't actually really definitive evidence that the Singer-Unger principle is correct. And what he points out is that the problem with their argument isn't necessarily that we have these incredible obligations, because that's the thing we want to push against, right? We still feel like we have some obligations, say, to the child in the Shallow Pond example, but we don't think that they're as big as Unger and Singer make them out to be. And what Appia is pointing out is he's saying that the real problem with their argument isn't that they sort of blow out of proportion the obligations that we have by using the Shallow Pond case. The problem is that they think that we can have these kinds of incredible obligations in the first place. And the reason why they can't justify these incredible obligations in the first place is because, as Appia points out, our reaction to Shallow Pond doesn't explain why we're obligated to save the child. And the principle that we would derive, or that Singer and Unger would derive from the Shallow Pond case, isn't one that explains those kinds of incredible obligations either. Okay. So we might feel the urge to save the child. That doesn't give us a clear explanation of what our obligation to save the child is. So that might seem a little strange, right? Because we would think that we're obligated to save the child because the child is right in front of us. It comes at very little cost for us to save a life. And what Appia is pointing out is that Unger and Singer don't give us enough of an explanation of what those obligations are to begin with. Yeah, we have these intuitive feelings, but that doesn't necessarily tell us what our obligations are. So to show what a principle that we could derive, so to show what a good explanation with a principle that you would derive from the Shallow Pond case would look like, he presents this thing he calls the emergency principle. So this is the principle that he says, this is one where it does explain what our obligations are. It does follow from our reaction to the Shallow Pond case. It does sort of tease out what's going on in our minds, how we're reasoning why, saving the drowning child is something we're morally obligated to do. And he spells his emergency principle out in the following way. He says, if you are the person in the best position to prevent something really awful from happening, and it won't cost you much to do it, then do it. So that saddles us with a much lighter obligatory load than the Singer principle does, right? Because there we're looking at being in the best possible position to do something and it not costing very much to do it. So it's not necessarily a matter of, let's weigh the harm and the good here. Let's try to tease out and do a cost benefit analysis of, what this particular person or group would lose if they donated the money or spent the resources to save this other life. There, it's more a matter of, what the people who are in the best position to no skin off their nose really make a difference, right? And I think that we immediately can start thinking about the types of people and organizations that are in this no skin off their nose kind of position, right? And in particular, what we should notice is that there's not a whole lot of individuals that belong to that group, where it doesn't do much to them and their livelihood or they don't have to sacrifice very much to really make a significant change, really get in there and make a significant change. Great. All right. So Elon Musk, Bill Gates, whatever his name is, Zuckerberg, some governments, maybe, I don't know, but with COVID, it seems like a lot of governments are really struggling. Definitely some big corporations, right? Apple, places like this. According to the emergency principle, they're definitely on the hook there. They definitely are saddled with some pretty significant obligations. Again, it shouldn't be too much skin off their nose, but they could be doing a lot more. Maybe not Bill Gates. He does do a lot, but I don't know. That would require research to determine. But those are the kinds of people and organizations where they're in the best possible position to provide an incredible amount of aid, save an incredible number of lives for really next to nothing on their end. So it's great. So that seems clear. And I think that, again, based off of things that were coming up in the discussion board thread, a lot of you are on that same page. Yeah, these big Jeff Bezos types, they are morally obligated to give a lot more than they actually do. So that's not something that that is like that we're going to dispute too much. And interestingly, it's also not something that's going to help us answer this question that Peter Unger asks about what we're supposed to do when we get a letter, say, in the mail or a phone call or something on our feed when we're looking at social media where a worthy organization is asking you, an individual, to donate money, right? So I'm just going to keep referring to that as, what we're supposed to do when we get a letter from UNICEF in the mail. But just bear in mind that that could take a lot of different forms. That could be getting emails. That could be, again, things showing up on your social media feed, people asking you to send money through a Kickstarter or Venmo or something like this. Whatever you keep in mind there, those are the questions that come up when we ask for us, like, the non-Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Apple type individuals that don't have anything, aren't nearly that well positioned or have nearly that much to provide a lot of aid. What are we then morally obligated to provide others far away from us in terms of aid?